It was, to put it mildly, an eventful winter in 1989–90. A few days after East and West Berliners joined in dancing on top of the hated Berlin Wall, the Bulgarian Communist Party was the next to change its name to the Bulgarian Socialist Party and remove the long-time leader of party and country, Todor Zhivkov, replacing him with Foreign Minister Peter Mladenov. The constitution was amended in January to remove the Communist Party's guaranteed leading role in government, and free elections were promised for the spring. In Prague, 200,000 people, many of them students, demonstrated for free elections. When they were met by violence from the riot police, numbers swelled to over 500,000 3 days later, and after a week of further demonstrations centred around Wenceslas Square in the heart of Prague's new town, General Secretary Miloš Jakeš and other Communist Party leaders resigned, and 4 days later the new leader, Karel Urbanek, announced the end of one-party rule in Czechoslovakia and again called elections for next year. In the interim, President Gustav Husak swore in a new government, the first in 41 years not to be primarily communist, and then resigned, with dissident playwright and human rights activist Václav Havel elected as the new president on the 29th of December. The entire leadership of the East German Communist Party, the Socialist Unity Party or SED, resigned en masse again in early December, this time including Egon Krenz, leaving Hans Modrow as a transitional leader while free elections were organised. In the SED instead elected lawyer Gregor Gysi, who had spoken out at the mass Alexanderplatz demonstrations in November, as their new leader. And in a symbolic move, the border crossing at the Brandenburg Gate was opened in December. In Romania, the Hungarian minority in the Transylvanian city of Timișoara, Temesvar in Hungarian, protested the eviction of local Protestant pastor Laszlo Tőkés, who had spent many years opposing the Bucharest government's policy of systematization, the attempt to concentrate Romania's population in large modern cities instead of the rural villages that characterised much of the country. People were forcibly evicted and moved into cities, ancient buildings and churches were knocked down, and ethnic minorities like the Hungarians feared they would lose their identities. The protests in Timișoara evolved into riots and then spread to strikes in other cities, and the military was losing control. In Bucharest, long-term dictator Nicolae Ceausescu stood on his balcony to address an event of some 100,000 people in the square below, and looked absolutely flabbergasted when they began to jeer. The following day, he was out, as the palace was invaded by rioters and Ion Iliescu took over as interim president. 2 days later, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were captured, and 2 days after that, Christmas Day 1989, they were summarily executed. And Poland, which had already held its first free elections, voted to end the communist system in favour of adopting capitalism and to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. In early December, President Bush met Chairman Gorbachev off Malta on the board the Soviet liner Maxim Gorky, recently refloated after hitting an ice floe cruising off Svalbard. Bush presented Gorbachev and the other attendees with pieces of the Berlin Wall, hacked off by some US servicemen sent to Berlin for the purpose, and expressed his support for the reforms taking place within the USSR and throughout Europe. Both leaders gave a press conference saying they regarded the era of the Cold War as over and were committed to future cooperation and peace. Even within the Soviet Union itself, things were changing rapidly. Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to abolish the communist monopoly on power, and in January 300,000 Lithuanians demonstrated for independence, while Mikhail Gorbachev met with the Pope and promised greater freedom of religion for Soviet citizens. And in February, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union voted to end its own monopoly of power. In Baku, in the Azeri Republic, there had been ongoing tension over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh for the last couple of years. The region was primarily inhabited by Armenians, but came within the jurisdiction of the Azeri SSR. Both local Armenians and the Armenian SSR government in Yerevan wanted the region transferred to the Armenian Republic to administer. Another region, Nakhchivan, was an autonomous region of Azerbaijan but was an exclave, cut off entirely by Armenia. There had already been a series of pogroms and massacres with populations fleeing in both directions, and now the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh was beginning to become entangled with Azerbaijani nationalism, as it seemed Soviet central control was weakening and many of the Soviet republics began to see clamours for independence. The already reduced Armenian minority in Baku came under attack from a nationalist mob, killing or driving out the majority of the 50,000 Armenian population, and after a week, Soviet armed forces finally stepped in, declaring martial law and putting down the riots. In protest, the ruling council of Nakhchivan declared its independence from the USSR and called for aid and recognition from bordering Turkey and Iran and the UN, and demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops. It was the first part of the Soviet Union to declare its independence. Other things were happening too, of course, around the world. Panama's General Noriega, under increasing US pressure to accept the result of the May election in which he had been voted out, passed a resolution declaring war on the US, and the following night an American soldier from the Panama Canal garrison was killed in an ambush. The not unpredictable response was Operation Just Cause, a full-scale invasion of Panama, which resulted with a swift US victory, though sources vary wildly on the number of civilians killed in the crossfire. Noriega himself took refuge in the Vatican embassy until finally surrendering in early January. On Christmas Eve, Liberia descended into civil war, as Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front invaded from neighbouring Ivory Coast to try and overthrow President Samuel Doe, who had been in power since 1980 but was increasingly seen as corrupt and totalitarian. The Japanese central bank announced an interest rate hike to try and cool the rapidly overheating Tokyo property market. 2 days later, the Nikkei 225 index closed at an all-time high. And finally, in February, South African President F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the African National Congress and the release of Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison. For now, the apartheid system would remain in place, but it was well known that de Klerk believed it could not be sustained, and the release of Nelson Mandela seemed to indicate that apartheid's days were finally numbered. Perhaps it is fortunate for the length of this video, then, that the 1990 Formula 1 season would see no significant rules or format changes from 1989, and only one change in the calendar. To avoid the summer heat, the US Grand Prix in Phoenix would now be the opening event on the 11th of March, followed by Brazil. The last race of the season in Australia would, assuming everything went to schedule, be the 500th World Championship Formula 1 Grand Prix. 2 teams had folded over the winter, the Zakspeed and Real teams, and with Christian Danner, Bernd Schneider and Volker Weidler all out of a drive, it seemed that there would be no German representation at all at the peak of open-wheel motorsport this year. The Coloni and Osella teams had returned to running a single car, but EuroBrun had expanded to 2, and with one new team, Life, also running a single car, pre-qualifying was down to a slightly more manageable 9, specifically the 2 cars each of the AGS, EuroBrun and Larrousse Lola teams, and the single cars of Coloni, Life and Osella. So, without further ado, let's have a detailed look at the runners and riders for Formula 1 in 1990. Ferrari. Wearing the prestigious number 1 on the Scarlet cars for the first time since Jody Scheckter's disastrous 1980 title defence, Ferrari finished the 1989 season looking good, and have spent most of the intervening time honing their car, engine and troublesome semi-automatic gearbox to perfection. With John Barnard leaving for Benetton after completing most of the work on the 1990 car, the 641 was finished off by Steve Nichols, who came in with Prost from McLaren and Enrique Scalabroni. It had larger fuel tanks and updated aerodynamics, but was still very much the same car, just, hopefully, more reliable. So too would hope Alain Prost, 3 times world champion with McLaren, and Nigel Mansell entering his second year with the Scuderia. Car number 1, Alain Prost. If Prost felt his third title was soured by the situation with Senna and the accusations that he'd been favoured by Jean-Marie Balestre and the governing body, only he would know, but it was clear there wasn't room for both of them at McLaren, and he felt he knew which one Ron preferred. The Tifosi welcomed the news of his signing with cheers at Monza, but things will very quickly turn sour if he doesn't immediately produce results, and Ferrari's political infighting can dwarf anything he experienced at McLaren. Car number 2, Nigel Mansell. Mansell was in Prost's position this time last year and won the fans over with a debut win and a series of trademark gutsy drives, but although he's publicly declared how well he gets on with Prost, he must have the memory of Piquet's arrival at Williams in the back of his mind. Ferrari will have paid a lot of money for Prost, and if they do what Frank Williams always refused to, and favour Alain over Nigel, Nigel will not be a happy man. Tyrrell Ford. Tyrrell are looking to build on their most successful season in many years in 1990, Harvey Postlethwaite and Jean-Claude Migeot are working on a new car, but in the meantime the team will begin the season with their excellent 018 chassis, driven by Alesi and new signing Satoru Nakajima. The Japanese driver's presence is the advance guard of a new deal brokered by Ron Dennis, which will see the Tyrrell team using 1990 spec Honda engines next year, prepared by Mugen Motorsport, while a major sponsorship deal with Rothmans got as far as having photos taken of the car before the deal collapsed for unknown reasons. So once again, Ken's cars start the season looking smart but rather sponsor-light, with the blue and white design a relic of the Rothmans deal. One further development just days before the first wheels turned in Phoenix was that Ken Tyrrell signed up with Pirelli, ending his 18-year association with Goodyear as the new works team for the Italian rubber, giving them not only first call on the best tyres, but also input into the design process. Car number 3, Satoru Nakajima. Japan's first full-time F1 driver had been at Lotus for 3 years and had shown himself to be a safe pair of hands if only occasionally a good racer, and his qualifying form was often questionable. 1989 hadn't been great in all honesty, and his 4th place in Australia, after his best drive of the season, was his only point-scoring finish. There were many who'd assumed he was only at Lotus because of Honda and were surprised when they kept him on for 1989 with Judd engines, and most of those are surprised all over again that he's found a new team. Honestly though, as long as he keeps the sponsorship money coming in, brings in those Honda engines and doesn't crash too often, Ken's unlikely to care if he doesn't pull up any trees. Car number 4, Jean Alesi. The find of 1989, Alesi started 8 races in 1989 and still came 9th overall, while finding time to win the European F3000 title. The young Frenchman with Italian roots, whose helmet pays tribute to the much-missed Elio De Angelis, was given an 18-month contract by Tyrrell after his debut at Paul Ricard, where he finished 4th, and with the departure of Jonathan Palmer, Alesi now becomes the lead driver for Tyrrell in just his first full season in F1. He turned heads in 1989, now he has to show that he can sustain that promise over a full season. Williams-Renault. 1989 wasn't quite back to the dominance of the PK Mansell Honda years, but still a pretty good season all around for Williams. 2nd in the Constructors' Championship and 3rd in the Drivers for Patrese, best of the non-McLarens in both cases. The Renault V10 was generally a good, reliable power plant, if a trifle down on raw power compared to the Honda, while the FW13 had 7 outings and took a win, 2 seconds and a third, so with some revised side pods and suspension and the new version of the Renault engine, it becomes the FW13B, as Williams stick with what worked so far. There is a feeling around the paddock, though, that neither Patrese nor Boutsen quite have what it takes to be champion, but then they said Patrese was all washed up a couple of years ago, so you never know. Still, Prost was apparently in talks with Frank before joining Ferrari, and there'll be a lot of people wondering which driver he would have replaced and what he might have done in the same car. Car number 5, Thierry Boutsen. Although he was the only Williams driver to win in 1989, the Belgian actually looked second best to Patrese most of the year and finished lower in the drivers' standings than he had with Benetton the year before. A testing crash in Rio before the season started might have knocked his confidence, and Patrese had a year's more experience with the team and with the FW12 chassis, so perhaps it's unfair to compare, but if he does want to shake his image as a competent journeyman rather than a champion in waiting, he has to step up to the plate in 1990. Car number 6, Riccardo Patrese. When Brabham were clearly in the middle of folding in 1987, it was widely assumed that Riccardo Patrese's 10-year career would come to an end too, and there were many raised eyebrows when this has-been was picked by Frank Williams to partner Nigel Mansell for 1988. That year's car was a bit of a disaster, but that didn't stop persistent rumours that Patrese would be fired or replaced by the end of the year. So imagine everyone's surprise when, closing on 200 races, he only goes and has an absolute blinder of a season. 6 podium finishes, on his way to 3rd overall, and, satisfyingly, ahead of Nigel Mansell in the standings. He'll be frustrated that he still hasn't won since his first stint at Brabham back in 1983, but if there's any justice, he'll put that right in 1990. Brabham Judd. Speaking of Brabham, the revised team had a tough 1989, unable to capitalise on their early promise and then dragged into ownership wrangles which continued into the off-season. Eventually, when the dust settled, the Japanese Middlebridge engineering concern owned the team outright, retaining Herbie Blash as team manager, with continued engine supply from Judd, a company financed by Jack Brabham himself way back when. Sergio Rinland as technical director and Hans Fuchs on aerodynamics duty are working on a new car which should be ready for the European rounds, but for the first 2 races the team will use last year's car. Stefano Modena remains on board, but despite having signed a contract, Martin Brundle got an offer he couldn't refuse from Tom Walkinshaw, so with his contract bought out, he's off in 1990 driving silk-cut Jaguars instead. Car number 7, Gregor Wojtek. Having spent a year failing to qualify or mostly pre-qualify in the EuroBrun and Real teams in 1989, Gregor Wojtek's Swiss Francs have got him a berth at the Brabham team, only for his father to make a major investment in Onyx shortly before the season started and sign Gregor up for them instead. With it all being at such short notice, a deal was struck to allow Wojtek Jr. to drive the 2 flyaway races for Brabham in order to give the team a chance to find a replacement. Whoever he does end up driving for, he needs to do something quickly to establish himself as a driver in his own right, not just daddy's wish fulfillment. Car number 8, Stefano Modena. Like the Brabham team itself, Modena, another ex-EuroBrun driver as it happens, peaked early in the season with his fairy-tale podium in Monaco. He usually qualified well, starting in the top 10-50% of his races, but was dogged by unreliability. Many in the paddock still rate Modena highly, and he will hope that 1990 will see better fortune for him. Arrows Ford. All change at Arrows. Well, not really. Actually, the chassis and the engine are the same, the Ross Brawn-designed A11 with Ford DFR engine in the back, but the drivers are different, gone the Anglophone pairing of Warwick and Cheever, and instead the first all-Italian lineup for the team since Riccardo Patrese and Siegfried Storr in 1982. Ex-Ferrari man Alboreto joins up-and-coming star Alex Caffey, but the most visible change are the logos of new majority shareholders Footwork, a Japanese logistics company, and the car is bedecked in their jaunty red diagonal stripes. Car number 9, Michele Alboreto. The veteran had a difficult 1989 following his departure from Ferrari after 5 years. Early signs were promising with a podium finish in the Tyrrell, but then a sponsorship clash of all things saw him turfed out and winding up in pre-qualifying with the Larrousse squad. He would be hoping for a bit more chance to rebuild his career in the Arrows. Certainly, at 33 he's running out of time to make it back to the top, and there must be a sense that unless he can do something spectacular this year, he's probably on his way out. Car number 10, Alex Caffey. The young Italian's stock had risen further in 1989 with a series of great qualifying laps in particular, but his results were inconsistent, often breaking down in the Dallara or tangling with other midfield runners. He might have had a famous second place if not punted into the wall by De Cesaris in Phoenix, but his lack of points don't seem to have affected his reputation any. He will hope, though, that the Arrows car proves more reliable than his old Dallara, and certainly than the Osella before that. Lotus Lamborghini. In contrast to Arrows, the outside of the Lotus looks the same, but pretty much everything inside is different. There's a new chassis, the 102, designed by Frank Durney and Mike Coughlin, based on last year's car, but accommodating the massive V12 Lamborghini engine, used by former Lotus man Gerard Larousse's team last year. It's big, it's heavy, and the car has to be wider to accommodate it, and the bigger fuel tanks it needs, but the outright grunt should offset that. The engine's teething troubles at Larrousse were one reason cited by Piquet for leaving the team, though, as he didn't think the engine would be competitive or reliable. Former boss Peter Waugh had been close to signing a big sponsorship deal with Coca-Cola and Castrol, but his sacking mid-season in the fallout of the DeLorean scandal means the team will have to get by on the ongoing Camel sponsorship, which has dropped off rather since the days of Senna, Piquet and Honda. Nonetheless, new manager Rupert Mannering, ever the optimist, reckons the team are on course for a haul in the region of 40 points this year, about what Benetton scored in 1989. The drivers to accomplish this task are veteran Derek Warwick and newcomer Martin Donnelly. Car number 11, Derek Warwick. Warwick came close to winning races at Renault, and then had 2 chances for a top team pass him by. Firstly, when he rejected an offer from Williams in 1985 to stay with Renault, then when he was vetoed from Lotus by Ayrton Senna for 1986. Well, he's here now, 4 years late, to find a very different proposition from the one he was kept away from back then. Pretty much everyone in F1 wishes Derek well, but he does seem to be one of the unluckiest men in F1 in terms of his career trajectory. Car number 12, Martin Donnelly. Ulsterman Donnelly had his Formula 1 debut for Arrows in 1989, deputising for, and recommended by, his new teammate Derek Warwick. He drove a solid if unspectacular race to finish 12th and last, 3 laps down, but he finished nonetheless. More importantly, though, Donnelly has been the Lotus test driver among his junior Formula commitments over the last couple of years, and he knows his way around car and team. If Lotus expect nothing else from him, he ought to be able to be an able replacement for the testing input of Satoru Nakajima. Osella Ford. The Osella team had seen an improvement in their fortunes in 1990, not that they actually finished more than one race in their 38 attempts, but the talented Nicola Larini had put in some good qualifying performances and shown that the FA1M had potential. Nonetheless, after competing since 1980 for scant reward, Enzo Osella has made the decision to sell up entirely to Gabriele Rumi, whose Fonmetal firm had provided sponsorship in 1989. An evolution of the chassis, just one, will be driven by French youngster Olivier Guillard. Can some new backing provide more than just a new paint job? Car number 14, Olivier Guillard. The young Frenchman had a mixed debut season with Ligier, repeatedly faster than the veteran knew, but he'd nonetheless allowed his immaturity to show on occasions, and his driving was never really shown to its best advantage by the dreadful car. The Osella probably won't help either, but he will be hoping that sole driver status and a bit of luck will help him to shine. Leyton House Judd. The March team had had a pretty dreadful 1989, certainly compared to their success the previous year, and there were fears that it could cost them. However, rather than pulling the plug, Akira Akagi's Leyton House property firm have gone all in, purchasing the team and naming rights outright. All the key staff stay on, with Adrian Newey designing a new CG901 chassis ready for the start of the season, which he hopes will be a bit more reliable than last year's, with the works version of the new Judd engine, and the team have also kept faith with drivers Maurizio Gugelmin and Ivan Capelli. There are questions, of course, about whether, after a disappointing year, keeping such continuity is a good idea or not. We'll see. Car 15, Maurizio Gugelmin. Gugelmin had taken March's only points of 1989 with a great third place at his home Grand Prix, and he was also the one who came closest to doing so again with 3 frustrating 7th place finishes in Italy, Japan and Australia. While in 1988 he had been rather overshadowed by Capelli, 1989 had shown for all its frustrations that Gugelmin was just as capable a racer, no mean feat in a team which had essentially been built for and around Ivan. Car number 16, Ivan Capelli. The Italian must have found 1989 a challenge to his traditional bonhomie and joker personality, but if so, he didn't show it. Outscored by his less high-profile teammate, he had nonetheless done enough with the equipment at hand to have not gone down in public estimation, and all waited to see how he would fare in 1990. His name does seem to be mentioned every time there's a vacancy or potential vacancy at a top team, especially one with Italian connections, and he'll be keen to keep the name there at the front of everyone's minds. AGS Ford. Many didn't think that AGS would see the start of the 1990 season after a traumatic 1989, but somehow they have, despite the resources being stretched ever thinner. They have at least finally moved into their new facility at Le Luc, but the wait to do so until January delayed work on the new JH25 chassis, which is now expected later in the year. For much of late 1989, the team were rumoured to be using a new engine in the unusual W12 configuration developed by Moteur Guy Negre, who used some old JH22 chassis in his tests, but nothing ever came of it, so the world was spared the alphabet soup of an entry by AGS-MGN. Instead, the team stick with the good old Ford DFR, and drivers Tarquini and Dalmas continue from the end of 1989. The cars are now all black, with some sponsorship from Ted Lapida's fashion range, but also a big question mark, literally, on the engine cover as they still search for a major investment. Car number 17, Gabriele Tarquini. After a single race for Osella in 1987 and a frustrating 1988 with Coloni, Gabriele had shown early promise after replacing the unfortunate Philippe Streff in the AGS team and even managed a precious point in Mexico. But after the team dropped into pre-qualifying, he got rather lost in the mix, and sadly they find themselves still having to make an early start, so the best he can probably hope for is to make it as far as Saturday. Car 18, Yannick Dalmas. Dalmas drove 4 different cars during 1989, 2 different Lolas and 2 different AGSs, and only started 1 race in 15 attempts. He had looked quite good in the Larrousse in 1988, but after a bout of Legionella at the end of that year, his performances had dropped sufficiently to be fired by them. Legionnaire's disease can cause lifelong neurological damage, but it's very difficult to know if Dalmas is genuinely still not recovered, or if he's just had rubbish cars. Benetton Ford. The Benetton team have provided two of the sport's last three new winners, Berger in 1986 and Nannini in 1989. All three, in fact, if you remember that Boutsen is a Benetton alumnus too. And in 1990 they looked to continue the Italian knitwear firm's ambitious programme to reach the pinnacle of motorsport. That means obtaining the services of three-times world champion Nelson Piquet and star Ferrari designer John Barnard, whose new B190 chassis will be ready for the European rounds. Until then, the B189 has been upgraded to B-Spec and will use the A4 version of the Ford HB engine as trialled in a couple of races at the end of '89. There were suggestions last year that the V8 Ford just wasn't quite powerful enough compared to the V10 and V12 engines in its chief competitors, so that is an area which the people at Cosworth over in Northampton need to look at. Car 19, Alessandro Nannini. Sandro had broken his winner's duck in 1989, and although it was inherited after the Prost-Senna collision, there were few who doubted it was deserved, and it seems a shame that he's been demoted back to number 2 driver status with the arrival of Piquet. There were just a few too many retirements in 1989 to go higher than 6th in the table, and he will hope for more consistency and reliability in 1990, as well as having to prove himself now against a triple world champion. Some believe Sandro is a star in the making, others that he's a decent but unexceptional driver, and 1990 could well be the year that settles that particular argument. Car 20, Nelson Piquet. The drivers' champion of 1981, 83 and 87 had not done his reputation many favours in the 1988 and 89 seasons, and underlined to many people their perception of him as a driver who faded away when the car wasn't perfect. He's 37 now, and many are seeing the move to Benetton as a way of winding up his career. Allegedly, he's on $100,000 per point rather than a standard retainer, which suggests that Benetton don't want him in simple cruise and collect mode. It'll be interesting to see what happens. BMS Scuderia Italia Dallara Ford. The Scuderia Italia squad had a pretty good 1989, having even had a podium finish with Andrea De Cesaris, and a series of excellent qualifying drives by Alex Caffey underlined the quality of the F189 chassis and its Pirelli qualifying tyres. The team will hope for more of the same in 1990 with the development of the car, the F190, designed by Gianpaolo Dallara and Christian van der Plein. Unlike many of its rivals, the new car will be ready at the start of the season, and the team will hope that they have stolen a march on the others. Alex Caffey's replacement as he moves to Arrows is last year's Benetton fill-in driver Emanuele Pirro, as Andrea De Cesaris is kept on by the team. Car number 21, Emanuele Pirro. After a number of thankless years flogging around Japanese circuits developing the Honda engine, Pirro finally had his break in 1989 as a mid-season replacement for Johnny Herbert at Benetton. He struggled on occasion, made the odd rookie error, but did well overall and earned himself a full-time drive for 1990 at the Scuderia Italia squad. He will hope to prove himself there in the hope of returning to a top team in the future. Car number 22, Andrea De Cesaris. The Italian veteran had a decent year by his standards, with a fine third place in a rain-soaked Canada, but he had also blotted his copybook by nerfing teammate Caffey into the wall at Phoenix when he was running second. Nonetheless, Andrea did well enough to buck his usual trend of a new team every year and was welcomed back, though no doubt his substantial Marlboro sponsorship helped. Minardi Ford. Giancarlo Minardi's popular little squad had their best year yet in 1989, thanks not least to the fantastic qualifying tyres produced by Pirelli that allowed Pierluigi Martini to place his car further and further up the grid. Nigel Cooperthwaite's M189 chassis was a neat aerodynamic package, and the team were only prevented by the usual poverty-induced reliability issues from doing even better. Martini certainly seemed to be enjoying his driving, but teammate Luis Perez Sala struggled, and he was replaced for 1990 by Paulo Barilla, who'd driven a substitute race in Japan and brought much-needed sponsorship cash, with Lois's Spanish money following Sala out of the door. Minardi begin their season with their old car until the new chassis is ready. Car number 23, Pierluigi Martini. After a pretty disastrous first year with Minardi back in 1985, Piero had spent a couple more years in junior formulae before being recalled in mid-1988 and proved a new driver. In 1989 he did his credentials even more good with a series of great qualifying drives and fearless races, and it's a shame that unreliability prevented him from translating that into better results. If he can keep that pace up in 1990, he will surely be on the radar for one of the big boys before long. Car number 24, Paolo Barilla. It's difficult to judge the Pasta heir on his one race in 1989, but he'd driven solidly on his debut and was known to the team from back in the early 80s when he drove for them in Formula 2. His F3000 results aren't exactly stellar, won 4th place in 2 years, but he won Le Mans in 1985 among other highlights of a more impressive tin-top career. Martin Brundle has shown that those skills can be transferable. Oscar Larrousse has shown that they aren't always. We'll see where Paolo Barilla lands on that scale. Ligier Ford. Another pretty dire year for Ligier, despite initial promise for the JS33 chassis, which in turn was heavily based on 1988's Adrian Newey designed March. For 1990, Ligier will use an amended version, the JS33B, with the March gearbox that proved so troublesome exchanged for one by X-Track, alongside a redesigned front suspension and some weight savings. There are those who suspect this may not be enough to rescue a team in deep trouble, but the choice of drivers looks canny. With both Arnoux and Guillard on their way, Guy Ligier has gone for Larini and Alio, two drivers who were notable in 1989 for qualifying in different cars well. Car number 25, Nicola Larini. Larini had a decent year in 1989 despite the limitations of the Osella chassis and the lottery of pre-qualifying. Particularly later in the season with an updated chassis, he managed to qualify as high as 10th in Japan, and despite only finishing one race, he'd been running 6th at Imola before having to pit for repairs and eventually finished 12th. Car number 26, Philippe Alliot. Dropped rather unceremoniously after 3 years with the Larrousse team, Alliot has gained one favourable reputation and one less so. Like Larini, he usually qualified well, and sometimes very well, even once the team dropped into pre-qualifying. On the other hand, once in the race he tended to be rather accident-prone, and when the car didn't fail, he was often to be found in a gravel trap or a wall, sometimes accompanied by someone else. McLaren Honda. 1989 was another great year for McLaren, taking their 5th constructors' title, 4 of which had come during the 80s, 84, 85, 88 and 89. Despite Prost's departure to Ferrari accompanied by designer Steve Nichols, the mantra "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" continues to be in evidence at Woking. The successful MP45 chassis becomes the MP45B, with redesigned wings and reshaped rear end to accommodate larger radiators, with the Honda RA109E V10 engine still in the back. Gerhard Berger comes in to replace Prost, and Ron Dennis will be hoping that the genial, fun-loving Austrian proves a better foil for Ayrton Senna than the highly strung Prost. The question will be whether Berger will be expecting to challenge Senna, or whether he has been signed explicitly as a number 2 driver. Car number 27, Ayrton Senna. The 1988 world champion put up a good title defence, but in the end was unable to match Prost's greater consistency, and was particularly hurt by a batch of DNFs in the middle of the season, sometimes mechanical, but on occasion he made the kind of mistake that suggests that he's perhaps not as unflappable as he sometimes seems. Could this be a weak point in the mighty Senna's armour? Car number 28, Gerhard Berger. For 2 years at Ferrari, Berger had dominated his teammate Michele Alboreto, and it's a shame that repeated breakdowns prevented him from truly comparing himself to Mansell. Once the car became more reliable at the end of the season, he opened his account with a second, a win and another second, so he clearly lost none of his drive and motivation. If he is to be a true number 2 to Senna, though, he may need those famous reserves of good humour. At least one thing is familiar, though. By dint of Ferrari and McLaren swapping car numbers, he will again be driving number 28 at his new team. Larrousse Lola Lamborghini. The Larrousse team had a trying 1989, with the Lamborghini engine suffering all manner of teething troubles. A shame, as the LC89 chassis was quite good, and the engine had a lot of power, a reported 600 brake horsepower, but Alliot's 6th place in Spain was the only point they scored all season, and the team dropped into pre-qualifying for the latter half of the season. New drivers, both of whom have had a race or two for the team and done okay, follow the new Japanese money into the team, and the Lamborghini engine seemed to be ironing out some of its gremlins later in the year, so 1990 could actually be quite positive. Car number 29, Eric Bernard. Bernard had had just 2 races for Larrousse in 1989 before Michele Alboreto came in and he went back to F3000. But in his first race in France he qualified 15th ahead of the vaunted Jean Alesi and ran as high as 5th before his engine gave out from 7th place. He improved further in Britain, qualifying 13th but again suffering a blown Lamborghini. So he returned to F3000 to finish 3rd in the standings, below fellow countrymen Jean Alesi and Eric Coma, before being recalled to the big time for the 1990 season. Car number 30, Aguri Suzuki. Suzuki had also made his debut with Larrousse, in his case towards the end of 1988, when he had impressed at his home race, but in 1989 a full season with Zakspeed, courtesy of his Yamaha connections, turned into a nightmare, and he failed to pre-qualify at every single race. He will hope to improve on this record, at least in 1990, with Larrousse being one of 6 teams in the early sessions this year. Coloni Subaru. The little Coloni team have struggled to make an impact ever since entering Formula 1 in 1987, and they will be hoping that their new partnership with Japanese engineering giant Subaru will bear fruit. They have contracted Carlo Chitti's Motori Moderni outfit to produce their engine, and they have produced a flat 12 design, intended to provide a similar power output to the Ford DFR, but with a lower centre of gravity. The engine was tested in Minardi chassis during 1989, but Minardi decided not to use the engine themselves, which might be a bit of a red flag, but potentially not surprising given their history with Carlo Chitti's outfit. So down the pit lane to Coloni comes Subaru, installing their engine in the back of a heavily modified 1989 C3 chassis. Instead of an overhead airbox, the car now has air scoops on top of the extended side pods, and the sheer size of the engine gives the car a very bulky look. Hopefully, it goes faster than it looks. A single car will be run, and Bertrand Gachot is driving it. Car number 31, Bertrand Gachot. After a difficult start with an Onyx team also feeling their way in F1, Gachot quickly showed that he was a decent driver, and gave the more experienced Stefan Johansson a run for his money. He was unfortunate to be the scapegoat for Jean-Pierre Van Rossum's eccentricities, and somehow it seems unlikely that Scuderia Coloni will provide an ideal shop window for his undoubted talents. EuroBrun Judd. As with AGS, there were many that were surprised to see EuroBrun return to Formula 1 in 1990, given that neither Gregor Wojtek nor Oscar Larrousse managed to make it to race day, and certainly few predicted the team would expand to 2 cars once again. The Euro racing concern have cut ties completely over the winter, leaving Walter Brun in sole charge. With an updated version of 1989's car and the same engine as before, the team will have an uphill struggle in 1990, but with the talented Roberto Moreno at the wheel, there's always a chance. Car number 33, Roberto Moreno. The affable Brazilian clearly has loads of talent. Winning the 1988 International F3000 title in an unsponsored car was no mean feat, but he just can't seem to parlay it into a decent drive. Scoring AGS's first point in 1987 didn't lead to anything, and in 1989 he struggled manfully with the Coloni Ford, managing to qualify rather more often than either of his teammates. A move to Minardi then fell through, so here he is at the struggling EuroBrun outfit. Car number 34, Claudio Langas. Born in Brescia, Langas started karting early and showed promise, winning the 125cc Italian title at 18 and moving into European Formula 3, where he spent several fruitless seasons with the Trivellato and Anson teams before signing for Eddie Jordan Racing and then Baron Racing and having much better results. Moving into Formula 3000 for 1986, he struggled again with stints with the first team, but in 1988 he moved to Forti Corsi and found things much better. Although he only recorded meagre results, at least some of this was down to accidents. Nonetheless, his move into F1 with EuroBrun seems to have more to do with the amount of sponsorship he's amassed than any huge amount of evident natural talent. Onyx Ford. Well, the Onyx team had a real rollercoaster of a debut season, which had ended up with a respectable 10th in the table, but turmoil behind the scenes, as the eccentric moneyman Jean-Pierre Van Rossum alienated drivers, management and suppliers alike, culminating in the resignation of team founders Mike Earl, Joe Chamberlain and Greg Field. During 1989, Van Rossum had loudly proclaimed his intention to walk away if his proposed deal for Porsche engines fell through. And when it did, he was as good as his word, leaving Alan Jenkins in charge, but almost no money. A Swiss buyout was put together by vintage car enthusiast Peter Monteverdi buying 50%, Carl Wojtek 25%, and Bruno Frey the remaining 25%, with Wojtek having to pay for last year's tyres before Goodyear would agree to supply the team again. Earl and Chamberlain were rehired, but Jenkins was soon fired for refusing to work with them, only for Earl and Chamberlain to walk out again on the news that Monteverdi wanted to relocate the whole team to Switzerland, and they took most of the team's experienced staff with them. Carl Wojtek's involvement meant that son Gregor was signed on as a driver, which was news to the two existing drivers, and nobody yet knows which will be expected to make way at Imola once Gregor has done his opening 2 races for Brabham. Car number 35, Stefan Johansson. The Swede had had a memorable year with the Onyx team, all things considered, scoring all 6 of their points but also failing to pre-qualify for half the races. His experience had been an asset to the fledgling team and he was rewarded with a renewed contract for 1990, but he will be hoping that the behind-the-scenes dramas stay in the background and don't impact his performance on the track. Car 36, JJ Leto. The young Finn had turned heads in his 4 races at the end of the season despite only qualifying twice. His undoubted pace had shone through the limitations of the car and many thought he'd be a star of the future. For now, though, he'll be looking forward to commencing his first full season with the team that gave him his break, but he is odds-on to be the one to make way for Gregor Wojtek. Life. With the turbo ban and the predominance in Formula 1 of V8, V10 and V12 engines, many engineers turned their thoughts towards the problems of how to extract more power without making the engine heavier or larger. Meanwhile, ex-Ferrari engineer Franco Rocchi had come up in the mid-80s with the idea of a W12 format with 3 banks of 4 cylinders each. After struggling for some time to sell his idea to a top team, he caught the eye of Italian businessman Ernesto Vita, who suggested forming a Formula 1 team to showcase the engine. The team's name would be Life, a direct translation of Vita's surname. With limited resources, the team purchased Richard de Villa's chassis from the abortive first team. As it had never raced, it was not officially a customer chassis according to the rules, and adapted it to fix some of the safety issues that had led to its failing its crash test. On driving duties, British Formula 3000 champion Gary Brabham. Car number 39, Gary Brabham. Second son of the great Sir Jack Brabham, Gary moved to Britain to start his racing career with indifferent results in Formula Ford 2000, before joining his father's team in F3 and finishing 5th and 6th in 1986 and 87 respectively. Joining Bowman Racing for 1988, he finished runner-up and moved into British Formula 3000, winning the series at his first attempt for Bromley Motorsports. Many years later, in 2009, Gary Brabham pleaded guilty to indecent dealing of a girl under 12 and served a sentence in a high-security jail. Then, in 2016, he was convicted of 1 charge of rape and 1 of indecent treatment of a child then aged 6. So you'll forgive me if I try to talk about him as little as possible.